everyone. My name is Lindsay Sullivan, and I'm the Education Manager for the National Demolition Association and your moderator for today's presentation. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Demolition Foundation's webinar series, Estimating, presented by Greg Menen. We do encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation. You can do so by selecting the Q&A tab on your control panel, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Simply type a question and hit send. As time permits, we will answer questions from the audience at the end of each major section of the presentation. And now I'll turn it over to today's NDA facilitator, Greg Menen, to get us started. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Lindsay. I appreciate it. I have to say, first and foremost, this is the first time I've done a webinar. So if it doesn't go completely as planned, I'll apologize up front, and hopefully we'll get through this as best that we can. Hopefully everybody is doing okay during these times, and we're happy that we can use the current facilities that we have in order to try and present a webinar, and we'll try and get through this as best that we can. We'll go through a little legalese on the first couple slides, but I do want to definitely express that this is a introduction to the foundations of demolition, as you probably know as signing up. This is one of what we have are 5 courses, 4 of them being the foundations that you can all sign up for. At the conclusion of this, we have 2 or 3 of the courses coming out in September, so we can take a look. I always encourage questions. It's kind of an interesting situation here because, quite frankly, we use the class as a basis to try and utilize information from everybody there. So I do fully encourage everybody to try and please type in and send your questions. Any of the questions that you have are always helpful. So with that, we'll try and get started. We've kind of taken sections of this to try and make up the entire hour. Don't mind it going longer. Hopefully it doesn't go shorter, and then at the end I will be happy to give you my contact information in order to contact me directly for anything that you would need. So I hope you enjoy our presentation. I hope it goes well, and we'll go ahead and get started. So obviously we're aware that this is the Foundations of Demolition Estimating course and is a webinar presentation. The legal portion of it, as I said, is that all rights are reserved on this. This is a document owned by the National Demolition Association, so please don't use everything that's in there or start creating your own program, which I'd probably be happy to attend if you did, without permission from the NDA. In addition, we have to give you the disclaimer. The information provided by the NDA and myself during this course is for reference only. It needs to be reconfirmed, and everything is job specific to your particular project. So the information created is general in basis. Please make sure and verify anything that you utilize with your own efforts. So, no different than when we have an in-person class, the ground rules. We'll go through the slides to try and hopefully answer questions as you go through. We would like for you to submit questions at any time during the course. They'll be saved, and we have the sections in here where we'll go ahead and address those questions and walk through them so everybody can hear. You've probably heard this 100 times, but there are no stupid questions. I have not yet run into one question that wasn't pertinent during the courses that we've given. So please, I encourage you to go ahead and ask them. It is for the benefit of everybody. And the last thing is on here is if the information is not readily available, I'd like to say I have every answer. There are certain things that I don't, but we work very hard to try and provide those for you, and if I can't answer them, we'll reach out to those who can and get you specific information and get back to you at any point in time to try and follow up with that. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. The demolition industry facts. We basically are all in this business, I'm assuming, in some sort of fashion. So the big question is, what is demolition? Demolition is generally broken down into 3 main components. There's interior, exterior, selective, and sometimes it's a combination of both. So we understand going into demolition, in order to try and develop an estimating program or an estimate, we basically need to understand what it is that we're getting into, and that every portion of demolition has its own means and methods in which to try and develop a type of estimate that needs to be put to it in a specific manner. So when it comes to estimating, okay, we like to say that estimators don't bid jobs, past production bid jobs. So what happens, or what does that mean? As you can see on there, when the bid left my desk, there was profit in it. Basically what that means is I think all you know is that you can't simply just run into a job and say, I know everything, from somebody who might come from an industry that has nothing to do with demolition. So what we count on is our knowledge of the business based over many years, or what we draw upon is what we call past production. In order to understand what the bid or the estimate and the efforts are going to entail, the best way we can try and do that is to learn from what we have done and completed in the past. And so what we really want to try and do is we want to be able to try and draw information, and or at a minimum start working with your company to try and talk to your superintendents, to anybody who's previously completed the work, so that we can try and understand how long something takes. In addition, it's probably the greatest source of information is to obviously go back and find out what went wrong. By understanding what went wrong, we correct those mistakes for the future, and then we put together what we can actually do. There's a lot of factors included in that portion, and we'll touch base on a few of those as we go through, and how and why that makes a difference. So, what are the goals of the seminar? You'll see on here that there is an abundance of items that we go through. I wanted to go ahead and list these items for you so that you have a full understanding. This is not what we'll cover in this entire hour. That would be an impossibility, or you would never get the depth of what is needed for all of these items. But I did want to share with you everything that we do get into during the full day and a half course. We go into the seminar goals, obviously, and keep in mind that a lot of those goals, when we develop this course, we have a lot of information, but we try and tailor those to the audience in which everybody comes in. You will find that when you sign up for the class and when you attend it, that we've had people that come to the class that have well over 30 years of experience doing this business, that they're second and third generation people that are coming in, to where I've had folks in some of the last classes that we did that literally are just starting up their business and actually haven't even done or completed the demolition project at this point. So it's a great source of information that goes around, and then what we try and do is tailor this information that we have here to the individuals that are in the room. It's never a matter of saying we have to stay on track for anything, but it's a matter of going through those items and then focusing on those that mean the most to certain individuals and the people, and what is to the highest benefit for maybe what you do, what your company does. So during the course of this, you know, we try and understand some of the building structures and the histories and the laws that went with it. We visit information about the contract documents. We talk about the site visits. A go or no-go decision, which people sometimes don't even think that they have to worry about. We get into the basics of estimating, 101. We try and talk about the quantifications of materials to be demolished, which seems to be a pretty heavy portion of it, and we kind of share how different people quantify the different ideas behind weights and materials. The methodology determination, we talk about the site work. Labor and equipment and how those rates are developed, maybe between owned equipment and rented equipment. What's the best decision to make about whether or not to purchase, not to purchase, and all those items. We talk about determining and how to configure or figure out the cost and rates of production. One of the biggest items that we could probably spend an entire day on is the salvage credit, identification of the different materials, the recycling, disposal, what those regulated materials now and what the current restrictions are in the laws, talk a bit about the markup and overhead. We definitely like to talk about what can go wrong, finalizing the estimate, and then at the end of the course, which obviously we won't have today, we do have a challenge course. The challenge course is really actually kind of fun, and I think one of the best parts of the entire program. During the course that we give, we like to try and bring everybody's thoughts and ideas together, and we actually break everybody up. We allow you to work with other companies and get their means and methods and ideas about how they approach something. We break you up into teams, and then we actually have a full-on bid of a small project. You'll be surprised to know that you would think that we would come out with probably a pretty level playing field at the end of that course and those bids, but it is actually surprising to know how those numbers come in and where they land. I could probably tell you everything, but I'll leave that out a little bit just to try and entice you to come and attend the course, which would be well worth your benefit. So what types of demolition are there? Well, we have total demolition, we have selective or surgical demolition, soft interior type of work, we have implosion, and then we have the remediation. These are all portions that fit into the category of demolition. So one of the very first things we need to know is the building structure and the history. As we get into it, the reason we try and focus on these is because it never fails. We have yet to really get into a building that was constructed last year, and then we turn around and go ahead and demolish it. Most of the time in our business, and having been around for a while, everything that we learn and what we try and understand is based on kind of a been there, done that situation, or we try and draw that information. You can see all the way back, if the buildings are back as far as the 1840s, you can see that the exterior walls only started being supported back then. And then we had cast iron columns come into play. Home insurance for buildings in Chicago's that are 10 stories when they started to build it. We went to riveted steel in the 50s, and then obviously all the new rules that came in for asbestos and everything else that affects us. So why is it important for us to understand the history? Well, quite frankly, I'm sure most of you are like me, and over the years, the drawings that we get are pretty slim to none. And generally, when we end up with drawings, things have been modified so many times that it's pretty rare that we get them. And even if we do, the drawings don't always reflect on what we really know has been the construction and how things have been modified over the years. So understanding, the structures that we get into is probably one of the best things we can know about how and the methods that we're going to use for estimating, because we need to understand how to complete the work and obviously do it safely and in a manner that doesn't hurt the public or any of our employees. So understanding that, one of the benefits I have for having done this for a long time and doing this starting 30 years ago and actually just falling into the business, when you started back then, the way to demolish a building was everybody thinks about, which is still today our logo because it grabs and keeps from our history, is the wrecking ball. So way back when, if you had a taller structure, you either took it down by hand, piece by piece, or you sat there with a wrecking ball and then brought it down to the level where you can get it with a standard size excavator or some other type of means that we'd use. So during that time, what I think a lot of you just entering the business take for granted is we had the introduction of the items that are shown here. We had the grapple, the thumb. The thumb alone was a huge additive to the excavator, bringing it together with the bucket just to do and complete the work. Hammer, which has been around for a little while, has changed substantially in its strength and power. The processor, the steel shear alone. The idea of way back when I started to think about that we'd have a shear that could simply cut through the steel and materials was just an amazing tool that was added, and multi-processors. Since this time, we've had tremendous increases. I'll give a little throw out to our annual convention. We just finished up our convention. and highly recommend. We had 30 different pieces of equipment at the site where that you can actually operate and manage, and at that site are these here. We do have our next convention that'll be coming up in New Orleans. Highly recommend that you go there and actually get an opportunity to try these out. We have everything from a processor with an attached magnet to the shears from the entire industry and the different manufacturers, to the grapples and actually multiple high reaches that we have on site. So I'm going to jump back just for a second here. I think one of the things that we want to touch base on, which is coming into big play for estimating as well, is the use of the high reach. You're probably familiar with it, but you know, the idea that we can now use a piece of equipment that is coming to the height, I think the highest one right now is a little over 300 feet. The average one here that we currently use is anywhere from 90 to 150 feet. Plays a gigantic role in the estimating process, and as these enter the market, you will find that you need to start understanding what their production rates are. So we do share that information during the course, and I think it's well worth trying to jump into and understand that portion as well. The laws that regulate the demolition industry. We try and get into the understanding everybody seems to take for granted for a while, so we kind of refresh the idea of going into these and talk about the federal guidelines that stand, which are OSHA, EPA, the labor laws, and even the IRS, and how it affects our requirements for the demolition industry. You wouldn't think that the IRS does, but you'd be actually very surprised. Everybody takes for granted the OSHA regs, but we also go into the requirements, talk a little bit about what the state requires, what your local agency requires, if it's a federal OSHA, and what those current standards are. We get into trying to understand the EPA enforcements. We talk about the different regions that the EPA enforces and whether or not it can actually be focused on a local level. We talk about the asbestos containing materials and what those requirements are for notification. I can tell you, being an LA resident at some point in time, that you would think that standard notification to the EPA is all you need, but you would find out that you also have to give notification to the city of Los Angeles, and that the fees on that are probably about 10 times higher than what you would give in a standard notification, and it's based on the square footage and the amount of material you remove. What can get into costing you thousands and thousands of dollars beyond what you even imagine. We do definitely talk about the stormwater plans, which is everybody's hopefully aware of, is known as the SWIP, which affects everything that is at a minimum 1 acre or greater. And in many cases, you'll end up in various states and local areas that you can't even have any water runoff on any demolition project, where you have to drop baker tanks, collect the water, sample it before you can discharge. Obviously, the OSHA enforcement, and we vary by state. We start talking about contract documents as well. Obviously, this is one of probably the most scary portions of any portion of work, and understanding this, and if you don't understand the contract documents or the specifications, this is where you get bit. Over the years, I don't think there's anybody in this industry who hasn't been bit before, based on the requirements, where we made the assumption that it was standard contract language, and you'll find that you get into indemnifications, and we talk about one of the items which is huge, and that is actually located on there, schedule and liquidated damages. And then we kind of get into the different guidelines and try and understand the difference between liquidated damages and actual damages. And one can be extremely expensive, and the other can be controlled and actually potentially used to your advantage. So we talk about that as well. We talk about the requirements in a contract of having to work with others. We've complained a lot and saying, hey, we're first ones in, we want to get out, and then you find out your schedule is slowed down by half because of other people, and there's no way around it, and you're contractually obligated. And then obviously conditions of payment. We talk about retention, how you can go ahead and negotiate for that, what's standard, what other people have done, and what we do, and when you can try and modify it. We do talk about the specifications and how that is the backbone of the estimate. We talk about different situations. We talk about how you can try and use this, and we also try and discuss some various language that you might be able to add to some of your proposals that may put you in a better position to negotiate the project on the back end. We always try and go into these with good faith, but we also have to understand that we're realists in the work that we do. So we want to try and make sure that we put down information that protects ourselves without possibly jeopardizing and taking ourselves out of the opportunity to win the job. So we do get into a little bit of between the estimate and the award. A lot of times people don't think too much about this. This is the time that is actually probably more relevant than anything else right now. We all probably had quite a few estimates that are out there. I personally have been going through that right now. And we talk about defining the estimate with assumptions, the exclusions, clarifications, who, what, where, and when, okay? This is a highly volatile industry, and it's not an exact science, as we know. And one of the big examples that I'll give right now, we bid a job, we're in negotiations right now with a project, and between the time that we had bid it 2 months ago, you can obviously imagine where the scrap market was when we bid it then, and even with some conservatism that we put in there on pricing, you can imagine where it's at right now. And this is exponential against all materials that are on the project currently. So what happens between the estimate and the award, and how do you manage that? What are some of the verbiage and the language that you can use in order to try and facilitate covering yourself without necessarily getting in trouble and being, removed from the bid? Okay. So I know it's a lot of information going very, very quickly, but I don't know if there's any questions that have been popped up. I'll be honest, I'm kind of new to this, so I got to try and see if Lindsay has some questions, and I think she'll throw them out there verbally if there is.
At this point, there are not any questions that have been submitted, but folks, if you do have questions that you would like to address, type those in at any time. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, there'll be a button that says Q&A, and you can send those and they'll come right to us.
Okay, I appreciate it. Hopefully everybody, I know that we're going through this very, very quickly, so hopefully it's not too fast, but please, by all means, don't think that you can't ask the questions for some of the things we went through or request any clarifications. Like I said, I think having the questions and throwing those out there for everybody is better than not requesting them, and I think it helps everybody. So, go, no-go decision. This varies for everybody. We do talk about it. A lot of times what we do is during the course, as I had said, we have people with the companies that are considered one of the largest demolition contracting firms in the nation, which quite frankly, we've had courses where the president comes and sits in, and it's fantastic. We've also had representatives from people like ExxonMobil. We've had people that have joined the class that come from a lot of the consulting firms, Burns and Mac, Wood. Obviously, we have one of our key instructors, which I'm very good friends with, Tim Barker, who works for AECOM. So we get a lot of insight from these folks, and they like to see, how a company goes around making a decision. So the go, no-go decision isn't always a simple matter of just saying, hey, what do we know? What do we don't know? Do we want to do it? Do we not want to do it? And so I think at some point in time, each company has a different means in which to do it. And some of the things we talk about as the variables that will, distinguish whether or not we're going to do it. So you talk about the type, the quality of work, availability of labor. We all know at this point in time that things are very, very tight when it comes to some of the project management that we're looking for. Heck, we're all suffering from finding strong and solid superintendents, and whether or not we can do it. We've had projects for the volatility of the scrap market. I've had multiple jobs where the owner wants you to take the risk on a project and you don't get the scrap for a year and a half, but you got to price it right now. So is it worth going after? The weather to be expected at the time. regulations which may be imposed by government agencies or even the owners. These are all variables that create an industry that you obviously know is very volatile in our business. A lot of things we have to try and guess, and we try and balance those things out against saying, hey, do we want to win the job because we need to work, or are we looking at too much liability on our part, because obviously everything always gets pushed down to the contractor, as we all know. So after you've decided to say, hey, we're going to go ahead and go for it, and let's go ahead and put our efforts into trying to bid the job, we go to Estimating 101. As we go into this and we sit here and say, how do you price your work? Understand that in the course here, the course itself, we hopefully don't publicize that we're going to teach you how to estimate and what is the exact science and what everybody else is doing. And the question always comes, why is that? Well, the difference is really if we have a piece of equipment that is a smaller excavator, but I have 20 of those, that makes it easier for me to run around to complete a lot more commercial projects. And then we get into a multi-story structure. The way I estimate it, because I have those smaller pieces, is going to be different than maybe my competitor who might have a high reach and saying, hey, I can do that with my high reach and I can get through it in this manner, versus somebody who says, hey, I have a lot of remote control pieces of equipment, or a Brock or a Husqvarna, or one of those pieces that you can use mechanically and have had great success on, and they'll go floor by floor. I've seen a lot of structures come down like that. So the idea is to try and help you or support you in trying to understand the means and methods and how to quantify those, and we discuss the different things that could take place, maybe some of the safety issues and those items. But we don't want to tell you, say, this is how you should do the job, because it doesn't necessarily apply to your company and the tools and the experts that you have within. So how do people price their work? Seat of the pants. I would say at this point, that's pretty much what we all do. The idea is to try and figure it out where it is, and then we end up refining that. But a lot of times we'll go back and we'll, confirm what we're thinking based on a square foot. If you go through and if you're familiar with it, there is a manner of doing things per cubic foot or even per cubic yard. We base that on like number 5 for the volume of material. How much does it cost me per cubic yard? How much does it cost me per cubic foot? There is a publication out there called the Means Guide. If you're familiar with it, the Means Guide is very basic in nature when it comes to demolition, and it uses a cubic foot method. We look at things based on equipment and labor, or as you're familiar with, time and material. And then obviously, I think you have to apply the historical data to everything that's all above. Again, it's about understanding what you've done in the past and how you can apply that to the future, and then figuring out, what's the best way in which to try and do it. So in any demolition project, we always seem to have to quantify the materials that need to be demolished. So during the estimating course, we do go through and we try and calculate how we're going to do it, and we have what we call common sense rules of thumb for estimating. We basically look at things probably in a very specific fashion. A lot of times, we have the discussion, we talk about the concrete, and I love this one because everybody goes through and we talk about the actual size of the concrete. And we sit there and we say, hey, we have the drawings and we're looking at a foundation, and it says, hey, it's 3 foot by 3 foot by 2 foot deep. And then by the time the job is done, your estimate and your calculations went over by 10%, 15%, or 20%. And given that it's a large job, you're trying to figure out why it costs so much more. And we talk about, hey, what's the actual means in which the foundations are actually poured, especially when it comes to a foundations. And, we try and remind everybody that, these drawings are written for an approval that shows what a minimum is. The amount of times that the contractor who built it back then didn't have the forms or weren't putting it in place and just dug the trench and poured the material in, and it met the minimum requirements. you have a lot more material, or you had a blowout. We talk about these quite a bit. We talk about standardization of units and understanding, materials and making sure that, if you're going to landfill, is it based on load? Is it based on cubic yards? Is it based on the weight and the tonnage? We calculate out the areas and volumes and talk about those. And then probably one of the biggest ones is obviously asset recovery and trying to figure that portion out, which we all struggle with. We try and talk about the various, means in which to try and remind people about, how things are constructed, and take in, again, as we discussed previously, the age of these buildings and what the requirements are in that particular area. It may be a requirement in the area that you're only allowed to have one roof and then you do a build up, or you can see in the picture here that you look at it and by the time it's done, you've got, a tremendous amount of buildup, and you figured on the job that you got one thin layer of sheet, maybe a little bit of insulation, and when you bid the job, you came up a little bit short. So we talk about the different types of things like roof construction. This is just one of many slides, obviously, as we talked about. We consolidated a lot of this and just kind of gives you a different idea of what we're dealing with. And we talk about the different types of items that are here, and whether it's built up, precast, metal deck, what kind of metal decks that there are, different things poured in place, and the different ideas that you're dealing with. Okay. We go into the different types of foundations, and the reason we do this is we try and understand that, when it comes to understanding the foundations and those requirements, what is needed. We talk about the grade beams, the columns, the pads, especially pilings, the caissons. Too many times the estimator goes in and we calculate out the concrete, but we forget about the effort that is needed to try and excavate and then remove those. And then we have discussions about, what is most cost effective? Do we go ahead and say, hey, the specifications say to remove everything to 3 foot below grade. So we've just run our calculations based on 3 foot. And by the time you know it, you're taking out 4.5, maybe even 5 feet, because the effort to try and break off the concrete at that 3 foot level just isn't feasible or cost effective. So is it cheaper and quicker and easier just to simply remove those portions of the foundation versus trying to say, hey, I'm going to cut it off? And then it talks about those specifications, and we talk about the ramifications of doing that and what the requirements are for the backfill, how much excess material. And we also talk about, as you can see on here, does the foundations or does the slab include the stone base or the clean up rock that's underneath? And then we relate that back to the specifications and what the language is into the contract and what it is that you have to try and consider and do. And during this whole course, as I said, we have shared issues that people have run into. We talk about these things, and it allows people to be able to sharpen their estimate and also take a look at any, potential items that, may run into problems for the future. Quantifying. Quantifying, I would say, in the debris section, which is what we talk about, we take a pretty good amount of time. And we have to try and figure out how much debris there is. And this is probably one of the toughest areas that we as demolition contractors run into. I have everybody that comes in, I've had people that just do this is so much debris per square foot. I have people that come in is, hey, this is so much debris based on the building. A lot of them pull off historical data. There's a lot of people that we have that just simply, as I said on here, do a visual takeoff, or they go back and say, historically, this is where they're at. And we try and talk about the different means that everybody utilize, and we get into discussing what is board feet, and specifically the different type of materials and understanding those, and we explain and try and go through, bringing you back to some of the basics that you might be able to utilize. How you get board feet, how do you liquefy it, what is the weight of that material? And then we talk about, why it is that we end up having more loads, or we talk about why is it that our trucking costs are so much higher when it comes to the debris portion of it. I'll take a quick peek at my next slide so I know. So we go here in the material takeoff, and we have to try and determine what type of material. So Is the material, if we have treated lumber, is that the same as the regular lumber? If we have different types of carpet, or we have the roofing, is it the same as any of the other roofing? Is it a standard across the board? And so we try and discuss each one of those items and how you can try and do a better takeoff. One of the things that we really get into, and we'll jump into the questions, is I'll give you just a bit of information with regards to dust control. We talked really quickly about what's the requirements for EPA, and if you don't know, which I'm sure you should, is that dust control is one of the major items with regards to demolition. But the interesting portion of things is that, you know, most of the time we bring a new laborer on site, and we generally put them on the hose because that's the easiest place to try and say, hey, I'm going to keep them out of trouble and harm's way. However, I will remind you that you have an inch line or an inch-and-a-half line typically coming off a fire hydrant where water weighs 8.5 pounds approximately per gallon. And then take into consideration how many gallons the water comes out of the fire hose. And so the person who's the most inexperienced is the guy who, or gal, who is spraying down your debris to keep and control any of the dust. And when he sprays all that down and he soaks every bit of what you have, and then you turn around and put that in the truck and haul it off to the landfill where you're paying per ton, you can imagine how much additional weight that adds to your truck, which means you have less material that can go in it because of the weight restrictions. And on top of the fact that you're paying for the water as it comes out of the fire hydrant, you're now paying for it at the landfill because you put somebody on there who doesn't fully understand how to control your water and control your dust. So these are some of the items that we kind of have a tendency to forget about, or that you sit here as an estimator at the very beginning of this and says, well, I had profit in it when I did the job. And then as your superintendent out there, which I know none of them ever do, is blame it on you as an estimator and saying, you know, where did you learn to estimate and why you went over? So these are the things we kind of talk about and go through. So I'm going to throw it back to Lindsay again and see if we had any questions thrown in.
Yeah, Greg, so we did have one question that came in.
Okay.
This person asked if you are aware, is there a public statistic about the number of demolition bids being awarded that is available per state or per type of building per year? Is there anywhere that has a depository of that kind of statistical information?
Well, it's a great question. I am not aware of anything with regards to that covers anything other than there's a few places you might be able to try and sniff around. As far as I know, there's not a specific publication, but all permits and information is public information. So if you want to try and find out in your area, you can do that. I can also tell you that public information is available for notifications to the AQMD. So before you start any demolition project, as you know, we have to put in notifications to the Air Quality Management District, which requires a 10 working day. It's not 14 days, it's not 2 weeks, it's 10 working days. So everybody needs to keep in mind that if they have a holiday, you got to account for that. And you can access and obtain that information. The only thing that it doesn't tell you necessarily is if you have an interior job or projects that don't require a notification, it's not going to give you that information. The other area, which is very general in nature, is the government keeps statistics on our industry as a whole, and a lot of that is consolidated with the Demolition Association, and I'm happy to bring that up to our industry council and maybe ask them to try and gather some information to start publicizing that you guys can get on the website and have a general understanding. Hopefully that helps answer what you're looking for, and if not, by all means, try and give a holler or send an email to the NDA, to Lindsay or to myself, and we'll try and gather what we can.
All right.
All right. Well, hopefully so far you guys are okay with this. We seem to be on track, I think, a little bit on time, and so we'll just kind of continue on and see what we can do here. So methodology determination. Obviously, you know, we talked about this a little bit earlier, and this is one of the things we talk about. We during the course, we want to try and introduce those items. I've been very fortunate to be involved in the conventions. We've had now going on for 3 years, which we just finished up, to actually have a live demonstration. And so the live demonstration during as part of this convention gives, the ability to kind of see the different type of tools and the equipment that is out there. So when we look at the methodology, what we want to try and do is optimize the equipment that we currently have as a company. However, there are times in which to try and look at to say, does that optimization slow my production down based on just the equipment that I have and the tools that are currently in the industry? So what we're trying to do is introduce the idea that there are new tools out there, and that sometimes a financial input into those tools and those items in the long run over a period of time will increase your production and increase the volume of your business and have a very strong return. So when we go to this, the first thing we put on here is a crane with a ball. And some of the questions are going, well, I don't even see that anymore. Does it still exist? Absolutely, it still does exist, and it's still a very good way to do certain operations and work. I would say the biggest limitation we have at this point is finding the right crane operator. They do make a wrecking ball still, but I believe it's only down to one company. It's special order, and but you can do it. Excavator demolition. We've separated that from the high reach that you can see on here. Although they are both excavators, the high reach is such a specialty piece and new into our business that we try and separate those to see where we go. Hand demo. The hand demo has really changed dramatically as well between the use of minis, skid steers, and one of the biggest introductions is the use of robotic equipment. The majority of what we have currently now is the Brock and the Husqvarna, and they do tremendous work. It is a very neat way of doing things, and something that everybody should probably look into. We have the strip out, which is generally soft demolition, interior guts as we call them, and then implosion, which is always playing a big part in our industry, even though it generally is the smallest percentage of the overall, but it has actually come a long ways in price and methodology to support a lot of our operations. So don't be afraid to try and take a look at that as well. We talk about the labor rates. Why do we talk about labor rates? Okay, because we get into the idea of prevailing wage, the unions, non-unions, and then regional considerations. During the times when things got slow, a lot of people went outside of their area. It is always good to understand who your competition is, where they are, where they're going, and then understand the wage rates that are required. There's a significant difference between saying, hey, I want to go ahead and take a job in the state of Washington versus trying to do one in the state of Tennessee. If you go there and say, hey, I'm a union contractor, well, you have very specific requirements about how many of your own personnel you can bring and mentor what's there. And the wage difference just for a laborer burdened in like the state of Washington generally is going to run you somewhere close to $45 to $50 an hour, with overtime required after 8 hours and double time required after 10 hours, and then time and a half on Saturdays and double time on Sundays. Whereas if you go to Tennessee or some of the other states, the rates will be considerably cheaper. So these are the things we kind of talk about, and the regional considerations, and getting into what those requirements are, and making sure that as an estimator, you're not simply just using the rates that are, standardized for your local work and stuff. I'm going to go back just really quick here too. The other thing we like to try and get into and discuss is what are those requirements for, say, per diem, hotel, travel, what's the travel time, and going through these things. Equipment rates. Equipment is probably the backbone of our industry. And, we have a specific picture here, and you can see that, we show equipment in this picture that, isn't necessarily brand new. And that's not a bad thing. We utilize our equipment and we have to question whether or not it's owned or rented. What's the best thing to do? We have everything from companies that will not own one piece of equipment and go rented because they feel that their production level is considerably higher, to companies and people that feel like, you know, once it's paid for, your operating costs are minimal and you can get a lot more done. So it's much different ideas behind the two, and we kind of have the discussions and we get into what's the time frame. At what point do you switch over from saying, hey, I'm going to rent the equipment to where I'm going to purchase it? We have a lot of relationships in this business and through our industry with a lot of the equipment dealers and the association, and we talk to them about different means in which they manage equipment for the sale. There is a strong deal out there now where you lease the equipment, and it's almost like leasing a car. As a matter of fact, it's extremely similar to it, and after so much time, you basically turn it back in, and then you obtain another piece of equipment. These come with warranties and costs, almost like the idea of saying, hey, I don't have to pay for an oil change and, you know, during the life of the car, and it becomes worth it. So we try and discuss the current options that are out there, and so you have a better understanding of what you can get into and try and make you look at, you know, things in a different mindset. Trucking, always a big item. We always have a good laugh about that portion and who and what we can do. And then certainly get into the small tools and how those costs and items affect your bid and what you get into and how they're affected. So we talk a little bit about the costs of production. We want to try and discuss in there, you know, what the cost, what are included in your bid, what isn't included in your bid, and we talk a bit about the fuel. What do we do about fuel and the variations in prices, where we get it from, transportation. We try and see where your costs are affected by the materials, whether or not it's crushed in the different areas, and try and include those in everything that we do. So it is something that we try and touch base on, and the different items that may or may not affect your bid, and whether or not they're included, or it just ends up being something that you end up absorbing in your bid. So I'm trying to see here. I think at this point, maybe Lindsay will pass on the questions. This one's pretty early and stuff, and we'll just kind of keep on going if that's okay, unless you have one that you want to throw out.
Sounds good.
Okay, awesome. Salvage credit. Obviously, this is one that we throw out that everybody seems to kind of have fun with. And there's a wide variety of opinions, and one that is not set for the business. In the scrap or in the demolition industry, we all know that salvage is a big item, and I think you'd all be amazed, and I won't give you the answer as well because it's part of the enticement to get you to come. The question is, should you credit 100% of the salvage back to the owner? And I think you'd be surprised as to what your competition says and the opinions it is between all of them, okay? Ultimately, it's a business decision based on market factors, risks, and your business cycle, but I think you'd be really surprised. But in order to make that decision, ultimately, you're going to need to understand, you know, each one of those items. We talk about it, which is surprisingly interesting. How many people know? The question is your price quoted in net ton or in gross tons? There is definitely a difference between the weights, and understanding how those prices affect what it is you're going to price back and what you're getting. We talk about the FOB to the job site or delivered to the scrapyard. We discuss, is there a minimum weight per load, which has a direct effect on how much money you're going to go ahead and get in return, and how you're going to manage the project, how you prepare the material, what material you're sending, okay? What is the recycler's policy on a regrade? If you don't know what a regrade is and what they're doing to you, which I'm sure everybody understands, it can make a tremendous difference. This also affects how you manage the material at your project site. We discuss that so everybody knows. And then how long is the price quoted for? We definitely talk about, you know, the different items with regards to scrap as to when the market changes, how the prices changes. Can you lock it in? Can you, set your price for the term of the project? You actually can. There's a lot of different options that are out there. that is well worth discussing and going through, and have this information to be able to put into your backpack of estimating, so that you can utilize this for the future and maybe try and lock yourself into a better position and minimize risk. So a big, huge section on the scrap portion that we go through. If you have questions, go ahead and ask them. But we try and spend a fair amount of time on there on identifications, what you can do, how the market fluctuates, and those different items. Recycling. I like to think that when we started in the business, and I've given various presentations and I've written some articles and stuff, and I think if you look at it, the demolition contractor was actually the very first recycling company. We used to take what was out there that people didn't want, and we go in and we take it and we try and maximize it out. So at the end of the day, we as contractors like to try and support the environment, and I think we take a leadership position in here, and one of the things that's established is the leads. We do talk about that and the requirements that a lot of companies have and what we can and what we can't do. We talk about recycling 98%. We've had jobs where there's 100% recycling. But at the end of the day, we try and figure out what is the most cost effective. I think, there's a balance between what is the cost between taking materials to the landfill versus having to take that material, send it out, and being able to recycle it. And some of that is a requirement based on your contract. So we try and talk about the balance between these and what you can and what you can't do, and discuss various means in which to try and sell materials. The disposal. We talked earlier about this very quickly with regards to, how it is based on, your water and your weight. But you want to learn how to calculate your tonnage. Is it by the debris? You want to be by volume. We talk about sorting it. We have a saying during this course and stuff is, is your disposal regulated by weight, or is it regulated by volume? And we try and go through, and answer to that question is first one wins. And we try and get into this to try and explain that how the estimate can vary from the operations in the field, and try and discuss how we want to pass each one of those items down to make sure that there's a full and complete understanding between what's in the field and also what it is that's on your estimate and expectations. Okay. We get into regulated materials. This is a very long section and has become a very big item within our industry. The asbestos, obviously everybody knows. We talk about, where the asbestos exists and where it can be. And I think everybody knows that. We also talk about the time frame, and we try and explain to everybody, just because the building was constructed after 1976, or even buildings that are constructed today, do they still contain asbestos? I think you'll be surprised at the answer. Okay. Other regulated materials that have hit our industry, obviously everybody is aware of lead, but PCBs has become a very, very big item. We all know about PCB and caulking now, and we discuss the means in which to have to manage that, and that's all the way from having to potentially saw cut on either side of the materials and what that requirement is. Universal waste, radioactive items, and a host of other regulations that are coming into play. And obviously we discuss the new silica rules and the regulations and as it plays into the estimating. Okay. Markup, we try and discuss this. We go through, we talk about change orders, some of the laws and the regulations that are required for both government work, and then what you're tied into for private work. And what is fair, what isn't fair, give you an idea during the class what everybody else does, and you'll be surprised at that portion as well. We love talking about what can go wrong, underestimating the quantities, overestimating production, failures. This is a great topic we go through, and we definitely learn from others as to what happened and why it happened. It is a fun learning experience to be able to go through with everybody as to, what can go wrong. It is amazing what can, and it's amazing what does go right. So we try and get into those and try and discuss The difference between the finger pointing, as we all know, everybody does this between the estimator and the superintendent out in the field. And so we try and close that gap a little bit so we can try and understand that a little better. Finalizing the estimate, the walkthrough on the demolition sheet, we definitely go through. You know, what we try and do is try and basically go through each one of the items, and we try and discuss those items with regards to what the estimate should have, what it shouldn't have, where are the holes, where are the pitfalls, where we could be and where we can't be. Some things get very complicated, and we try and share those experiences through the course and be able to get those. As we had said, we have a project challenge. I think on the project challenge, we've done a couple of things. We have one project that we used for a long period of time, but the other thing we're doing too is we're moving to the project challenge with regards to tying it into the other course. It's a substantial job. We talk about the different items on that challenge. It's interesting to know what you include, what you don't include, what we request of you, and what isn't requested, and what you have to try and figure out as estimators. And then we go through and, you know, we discuss each one of those items. It's a great tool for feedback and understanding where things stand, how other people look at items, and it gives you some pretty strong insight when it comes to the estimating in general. We generally, after that, go through that bid review and we give an award. It is, you know, it is a good insight. Again, you know, the award, well, you know, we choose which team works best, and there's nothing better than bragging rights in our business, which I know every one of you use. So I want to conclude this a little bit. I think we're pretty close on the time with where we're at. I got about 3 minutes, which I think is pretty good. In addition to this estimating course, we have a job cost tracking course, project management, risk management, which creates the certification for the overall. We also now have a superintendent course that is tied together with our convention, which does a little hands-on as well. Why is this important? This is important because the NDA has great relationships with the consulting companies and the arms that are out there, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers. We are working on putting this together as a certification program that is accepted industry-wise and is also going towards the government agencies. However, don't think this doesn't benefit you in that manner. Actually, one of the companies I know for a fact, which is like AECOM, now mentions this, and the Army Corps is also mentioning this, and gives you a certain amount of points towards betterment of the project and your position in the bid, which can help you win the project, showing that you have people that have been trained through these courses. We certainly hope that you'll take the time to try and take a look at these and consider, you know, enrolling as soon as they come out and walk you through those. So pretty much at the end, hopefully we maybe got a question or two, and we'll see what's up.
Yeah, Greg, so you have another question. From your experience, what are the 3 main missed items when estimating a demolition project that impact your final profit?
Oh man, I've missed so many over the years that I'm trying to think of the main ones. I would say probably the very first one is quantification. Probably the hardest portion is quantifying, or there's a miscalculation, or you have an excess amount of materials or items that you did not count on. You'll know in the course, one of the slides that wasn't put in there, but which was talked about, is if you can't see it, you can't bid it. However, probably the second biggest item is the contract language and missing those requirements within. Too many times there is estimates that go out that the contract has specific requirements, and even though you feel that you estimated everything, those specific requirements create a problem. And a perfect example of that, and a missed item, is probably backfill and compaction. Too many times we just assume that we're going to have a backfill, but then what happens is that you find out that they want a specific compaction requirement, which requires you to do it in certain lifts, or you can only import certain materials, and that it has to be tested with an engineer, and we miss those items, and that starts to get into a lot of money. I would say the third and probably one of the largest items is missing on the scrap quantities, quantifications, or types of materials, or understanding the market itself and those variations, and just simply missing out in one of two ways. One is missing out in, I guess, income or expected income for the project, in that you didn't hit where you need to be and you gave a credit back for it and you're not there. Or two, that you were so conservative or you didn't give monies back and that you never had an opportunity to win the job because you actually missed those items. So it's not always a matter of understanding that you missed it because you think you don't have money in the job, but that you never end up getting the job because you didn't quantify and do things correctly. So hopefully that answers, but you're more than welcome to have discussions with me and contact and ask any other questions you'd like.
Thanks so much, Greg. We are at the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Greg, do you have any final comments before we close out?
No, I think at this point, I think my final comments are this. We are all in an industry that is not offered by university. We all don't go to school and grab a degree in demolition management. We do get the ones in construction. So most of this information and everything we learned is a generational pass down. We are a close-knit group. I think we need to rely on ourselves to try and better the industry, and I highly suggest taking these classes, but probably first and foremost, I want to praise everybody who came on. It's appreciated because it does mean that you are interested in the industry, take it seriously, and want to better it. So I want to send out my thanks. The other thing is I want to also send out a please be safe. These are very, very strange times. I hope everybody's doing okay, and please watch out for each other.
Thanks, Greg. So just as we are closing out, I did want to give you all a couple of reminders. First, as Greg mentioned earlier, we do have the full day-and-a-half course coming up in September. It's September 23rd and 24th in Chicago. And we'll also be offering our risk management course in Chicago right around that same time. So you can do 2 of your 4 courses if you're interested. The information to register for those is available on the NDA website. We've also got 2 more webinars in this series. So next week, Tuesday, May 5th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time will be our project management course with Tim Barker. And then 2 weeks from today, May 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern, Greg here will be back with us for job cost tracking. Be on the lookout for emails from NDA to get registered for those, or you can head to the NDA website. If you go under education and events and then demolition webinars and online training, those are already available to get registered. The last thing as well, later this afternoon, you'll receive an email from me with a brief evaluation survey. It'll take you 2 or 3 minutes to answer. We really do value your feedback. This is the first webinar series of this type that NDA has done in many years. And especially with the current times as they are, we're looking at potentially expanding these types of offerings. So we'd love to hear your feedback and how we can best be getting information to our members and to the demolition industry as a whole. So if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to contact us. You can reach me directly at education@demolitionassociation.com. Thanks again for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.